Professor Yandem and Professor Zavagno for your generous, very generous presentation, actually, and for inviting me today. I'm honored to take part in this seminar series. Now I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Okay. Can you see well? Can you hear me?
Yes.
As well?
We can see and we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. And the subject of this talk today is a part of an ongoing project that initiated in 2017 and that aims at the critical assessment of the research material produced during a series of field trips in the Eastern Mediterranean between 1960s and early 2000s. This project has been sponsored by Sapienza University. Not this project, but the field trips were sponsored by Sapienza University, the Italian National Council of Research, and the Ministry of University and Research. So this material, mainly photographs, is now preserved at Sapienza in an archive that has been specifically created for it in 1996, the Center for Documentation of Byzantine art history. One of the goals of the project is the digitization of the photographs and the creation of an online database, which is currently under construction. A first step, as it has been mentioned, was the exhibition of photos held in 2018 and 19 at Anamed in Istanbul, that maybe some of you have had the chance to visit, that I co-organized with Giovanni Gasbarri from Sapienza University. Today, I will focus on the research that the group from Rome carried out in one of the several regions visited during so many years, that is Cilicia and Isauria. Just very briefly to frame geographically and historically the research that had been carried out by the scholars. The Cilicia, as we know, is the toponym which in antiquity identified the Roman province in the southeastern coast of Asia Minor, stretching from the river Manavgat to the west to Mount Amanos to the east. The western area, as we can see in this very simple map, is mountainous, since it includes the final part of the Taurus Mountains, whereas the eastern area is a large plain. The western is the so-called Cilicia Trachea, rough Cilicia or mountainous Cilicia, and the eastern is a Cilicia Pedias, plain Cilicia. Diocletian in the late 3rd century unified the Cilicia Trachea and the small region of Isauria that we see here. That was initially a small region in the northwestern area of the province and created the Provincia Isauria. From the 5th century onwards, the latter corresponds to ancient Cilicia Trachea, and in fact, the two names sometimes overlap. This is just a clarification because we can encounter the same archaeological site as mentioned either as part of Cilicia or of Isauria. It's basically the same. Cilicia was conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century and the Byzantine recaptured it in 965. And later from the 12th to the 14th century is included first in the Crusader and then in the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia until the Turkish conquest that began in 1375. My paper will be organized in two parts. In the first, I will explore Italian scholarship on Byzantine art in the 20th century, pointing out the most interesting names or contributions for art history of Cilicia, and early modern and modern tradition of travels to and studies on Cilicia specifically, and I will begin from around the year 1800, selecting especially those who left visual documentation of the Byzantine monuments. In the second part, I will describe the travels of the team of scholars from the University of Rome to Cilicia, began in 1989, and the value of the rich photographic material they produced. It might seem a bit odd to talk about travels in a time when traveling has become so difficult and we are all struggling so much, but I hope that this will help us reconsider once again the importance of first-hand study of the material we research on. And it is something that the two previous lectures have stressed very well too. To outline briefly the tradition of Byzantine art history studies in Italy, it is important to me to contextualize the field trips to Turkey in the academic environment in which they were conceived. Italy had enjoyed a long tradition of studies on Byzantine art, which dated back to the earliest years of the 20th century. Adolfo Venturi and his student Antonio Muñoz already participated in the international debate, which was arising around new discoveries, restorations, and critical assessments of Byzantine monuments in Istanbul, in Anatolia, and also in Italy. Muñoz even contributed in organizing the first international exhibition ever of Byzantine art, the Esposizione di Arte Italo-Bizantina, which took place in 1905 at the Greek monastery of Grottaferrata, near Rome. In the following years, another student of Venturi, Pietro Toesca, who devoted a 3-tome book to the art of the Middle Ages in Italy, he included Byzantine art as a relevant component of medieval Italian art. Nevertheless, for a number of historical and cultural reasons, such as the increasing nationalistic propaganda during the fascist period, and even after World War II, because of a perduring hostility towards a period that was considered one of decadence of the arts, Byzantine art history did not find its space as an independent discipline in Italian universities up until the mid-1970s. Before then, when it was taught, this was within the framework of medieval art history. And only if the professor had a specific interest in it, the students could learn about it. This was the case, for example, with Geza de Frankovic. He was a student of both Toesca and Venturi, which I mentioned previously, but he expanded his interest even further to Persia and Central Asia, being particularly fascinated by the possible substantial role played by Eastern, namely Syriac art, on medieval European as well as Byzantine art. And this was an idea that had been already elaborated by Strigovski at the beginning of the century. In 1951, he developed the hypothesis that from the foundation of Constantinople until the iconoclast period, the art of the Byzantine Empire was polycentric, and that the new Rome, Constantinople, did not yet exercise a real cultural or artistic hegemony. Instead, there must have been an intense exchange and migration of models, ideals, master builders. This remark is relevant for the development of the studies on Cilicia, as we're going to see in a moment. Despite this subjection to local medieval art and the bias attached to it, studies on Byzantine art history were thriving elsewhere in Italy at that time. And I wish to recall at least Sergio Bettini in Padova and Giuseppe Bovini in Bologna. Also, international congresses were held and international contacts were established, not only with European and American scholars, but also with Turkish ones. Looking back at Rome, Geza de Frankovic, as full professor of medieval art history at Sapienza, devoted several courses to Byzantine topics, such as Nicaea, Ravenna, applied arts in Byzantium. But most importantly for our purpose, he was involved in the first field trips officially supported by Sapienza Art History Institute and the National Council of Research. And these trips took place to Armenia. In fact, the systematic exploration of Anatolia by a team of art historians from Rome began with travels organized in the Caucasus, Eastern Turkey, and Northern Iran in 1966 and 67, with the goal of studying Armenian architecture and documenting the current state of the monuments by means of a photographic campaign. The initiators of these on-site experiences were a group of young architects, among which there were Paolo Cuneo and Tommaso Breccia Fratadocchi, and Cuneo especially might be familiar to those of you who are into Armenian architecture. The institutional support was provided by De Frankovic, and the project took the title Study and Survey of Medieval Armenian Monuments. The first outcome of the research was the photo exhibition held in 1968. When the group had visited the region of Van, another scholar from the same university took part in the trip, Fernanda de Maffei. Fernanda de Maffei trained as a philosopher and as an early modern art historian at the universities of Padova and Pavia in northern Italy, and approached the art of the Middle Ages thanks to her teachers, Edoardo Aslan, and in Rome, where she specialized, Mario Salmi, Leonello Venturi, and Gesa de Frankovic. After she arrived in Rome from northern Italy, she established contacts with many international scholars, such as Richard Krautheimer and Viktor Lazarev, of whom she became close friend. In the 1950s, both Lazarev and De Maffei incidentally had the chance to take part in the making of the World Art Encyclopedia, the Enciclopedia Universale dell'Arte, where De Maffei was in charge of coordinating the medieval section. The encyclopedia was a major educational project that marked in Italy a landmark for post-war cultural growth. The purpose was essentially educational for the general public, but its realization was entrusted to distinguished members of the academic community of the time. Not only Italian, many international scholars were involved in the project. De Maffei's involvement in the research trips to Armenia was certainly a starting point, a turning point for her to begin envisioning new on-site research in Anatolia and in the Eastern Mediterranean. Therefore, as soon as she received her appointment as professor of Byzantine art history, and by the way, that was the first chair in Italy dedicated to our discipline, and this happened in 1973, she began planning a new on-site research. She sought the collaboration of colleagues from other universities, such as Italo Furlan from the University of Padova, and most importantly, of her students. The new wave of travels began in 1975, when De Maffei, with a group of graduate students, first visited Lycia. Since then, almost every summer, a new field trip would take place in all of the regions that once were included in the Byzantine Empire, with different projects carried out by different young scholars. They traveled to Egypt and Israel, then to Istanbul and Western Anatolia, then Syria, Jordan, Greece, Cyprus, Tunisia, and then again, since 1983, to Turkey, with the goal to study the eastern border of Justinian, Mesopotamia, and to Rabbin. Missions to Cilicia started in 1989. To contextualize the position of the new exploration of Cilicia, we need to see what had been the contribution of the knowledge of this region in early modern and modern studies. But here I will select fiercely because I don't want to bore you too much. Although we know that European travelers were exploring Cilician region in 1700, I will leave them aside and only mention those who traveled after 1800. Since the 19th century can be considered as the cradle of scholarly literature proper. William Leake lives in 1800, thus inaugurating the series of British travelers of the 19th century who dedicated their exploration to antiquity. Other British diplomats, antiquarians, artists reached these lands, and sometimes took back with them as souvenirs beautiful engravings, but just very romantic in style. The French Orientalists and travelers Léon de Laborde, Charles Texier, and Victor Langlois can be considered the pioneers of the scholarly exploration of Byzantine and medieval Cilicia. And all three left some visual material, namely engravings and a few basic descriptions of the monuments. Langlois visited the region in 1852-53 by request of the French Ministry of the Public Education and reported his travel in two different volumes. In the first one, Le Rapport sur l'exploration, that is the real report. The other one, which is much richer with illustration, so it seems more interesting for us, actually is just a narrative of this trip, so not completely reliable. Towards the end of the century, Arthur Hidlam deserves to be mentioned because he was among the first to use and publish photographs to document Byzantine monuments of Cilicia. In the introduction of his book, he affirms that he visited Cilicia in 1890, and introducing the monument of Alahan Monastir, he refers directly to Laborde, but he says, it was, and I quote, "It was not until some months after our return that we found Laborde's description. Until then, we imagined we had been the first visitors to the site." So do we have to think of a bibliographic slip or something like that? At the turn of the century, historiography on Byzantine monuments of Anatolia is indebted to Joseph Strigovsky, the author of Orient oder Rom, who in 1903 published his book on Kleinasien, ein Neuland der Kunstgeschichte. However, he seems not to have studied the region or visited the region directly, and he publishes instead the survey conducted by John Crawford. However, Strigovsky expresses incidentally his regret because Cilicia was still a neglected region as far as early Christian art was concerned. However, the title he gave to his volume was somehow very convenient in this perspective, since Asia Minor, and including Cilicia, was really going to become the core of new fruitful research on the art history of Byzantium during the century that was just beginning. And Strigovsky's book was indeed stored in the luggage that the most renowned of the explorers of the early 20th century was taking with her during her travels. We all know Bell's adventurous life, Gertrude Bell's adventurous life, and her travels to the Middle East. Although her work is still inscribed in the 19th century approach, and her written description cannot be considered scholarly proper, but they are, however, the fruit of a very attentive eye. And her contribution is really valuable, I think, in that she was among the first who exploited a new technological tool, photography. She exploited it extensively. She was not the first, of course. And she left an incredible amount of material that after over a century we still consider valuable and we still use. Perhaps it was her skill in the management of camera that made of her such a good observer. And that is why we still can use her picture even for scholarly purpose. In her travels around Turkey and Syria, Bell visited Cilicia in spring 1905 and then published her reports in a series of 6 articles appeared on the Revue Archaeologique. After the outbreak of the First World War, and in combination with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the new Republic of Turkey, first-hand studies of Anatolia were temporarily suspended, only to be resumed in part in the 1930s. After World War II, in the 1950s, the scholar who produced the most substantial series of pivotal studies on Cilicia, on Byzantine monuments of Cilicia, was Michael Gouch, the director of the British Institute of Archaeology at Ankara. He produced a very long list of studies, both on individual monuments and on general overviews, and he devoted most of his research to Alahan Monastir in particular, on which he went on several times until his studies were collected many years later by his wife. Alahan is a key monument also for the first Italian scholar that I am considering in this Cilician overview, Paolo Verzone. He was a historian of architecture who initially devoted his scholarly activity mainly to medieval architecture in northwestern Italy, but he also studied Ravenna and the connection between Italy and the East. In 1952, Verzone was invited to teach at Istanbul Technical University, where he remained for 5 years. And this experience was a turning point in his career, since he reinforced his interests in the Byzantine architecture. During his Turkish years, he took part in the archaeological excavation at Side, at that time directed by the Turkish archaeologist Arif Müfid Mansel. And most importantly, initiated the systematic archaeological research at Hierapolis of Phrygia. Verzone might be best known for his very insightful article that I'm showing here on the tetrarchs in Venice, which he suggested could be originally mounted on twin columns in the Philadelphian in Constantinople. This hypothesis, as we all know, was later confirmed, since in the area, the missing foot of one of the statues was found. Verzone explored Cilicia too, and left some contribution on it. One of his books is dedicated to Alahan Monastir, the site that was being studied by Gauch before. While surprising enough, in his observations on the cities, the Hellenistic and Roman cities of Asia Minor, he does not mention the Byzantine phase of the site. But even on the pages of a Roman Hellenistic focused study, he could not resist publishing a photo of the Doline at Canle di Vanè with that spectacular view of the church number 4 on top of the slope. Verzone was also in charge of writing the entry Bizantino Architettura, Byzantine architecture, for the World Art Encyclopedia that I mentioned before. It is interesting to note that in this article, on the encyclopedia, Verzone presents early Byzantine Cilicia as one of the cradles of the new architecture of the empire. Although the impact of local innovation on the major achievements of later Byzantine architecture was still to be fully recognized. The early Cilician basilicas, such as those of Kadirli and Can Basel, are considered as derivatives of Syrian architecture. The complex of Alahan Monastir, on the other hand, is put between a still classical imbued style of the ornaments and the renewal which characterizes the 5th century architecture, referring in particular to the central dome structure. It has to be noted that Verzone offers some remarks on the already poor state of most of these buildings and their ongoing logoration. The idea that Cilicia, and specifically its western part, Isauria, was a land of architectural experimentation was further considered by Cyril Mango in his 1966 article Isaurian Builders, where, based on literary evidence, he argues that this land had traditionally produced master mason who were so skilled and popular that the term Isaurian had become the very synonymous of mason. It has to be considered that the Emperor Zeno came from Isauria, where he also commissioned new churches. And this circumstance must have eased the transfer of workers from the province to the capital. Semaviege doesn't need any introduction, of course, but what I would like to stress is that he had a special connection with Italian scholars in Turkey. He had participated in several international congresses, also in Italy. He had traveled with Verzone throughout Anatolia, and he contributed with his thorough knowledge of Byzantine art in Anatolia to several projects, including those of Cilicia carried out by the Sapienza team. 3 comprehensive and important works issued in the 1980s are those of Robert Edwards, Stephen Hill, and Claude Mutafian. And in those years, of course, also Friedrich Hild and Hans-Gerd Hellenkemper were preparing their outstanding and irreplaceable volumes of the Tabula Imperii Byzantine. This is basically the situation at the time when the team from Rome began their research in Cilicia. The field trips led by Fernanda de Maffei, began in fact in 1989, as I mentioned, when the trips to Tur Abdin had to be suspended. The picture that I'm showing is sort of introduction, but it doesn't refer to Cilicia. We see here on the left Antonio Jacobini driving the car, and Fernanda de Maffei. Antonio Jacobini was one of the members of the team, a student of Fernanda de Maffei, who is depicted on the right. But they are driving through Tur Abdin here. But unfortunately, I didn't have a similar picture for Cilicia. So along with de Maffei, Professor Italo Furlan from Padova, Antonio Jacobini, depicted here, and Andrea Paribeni, Mauro Della Valle, and Enrico Zanini were involved in this new research. As sometimes happens, the choice to study this region, Cilicia, had not been planned in advance. In fact, the plan for the summer of '89 included a new survey of southeastern Turkey along the eastern border of Justinian, but due to turmoil and the presence of Iraqi refugees, visiting the area might have been dangerous or at least very difficult. Therefore, the group decided to change their plans and to visit the coastal area instead. The decision revealed a promising intuition, and Cilicia became the focus of new, intense and stimulating research which lasted for a decade and even more. It was also perfectly fitting with the framework of the wider research project, Study and Survey of Armenian and Byzantine Monuments, thanks to the crucial role that Cilicia had played as a crossroads throughout the Middle Ages. Incidentally, in the same years, the Italian archaeologist Eugenia Equini Schneider and her team were already excavating at the site of ancient Elaiusa Sebaste. The official reports preserved in the archive of the Center for Documentation of Byzantine Art History at Sapienza state that in the first year, the team chose to focus particularly on the area around the city of Silivke. The research program consisted of 3 main points. The first, the thorough study of topography and monumental remains of urban centers and monastic settlements. And they mention, in the document, they mention Meryemlik, Korikos, Uzunca Burç, Koropissos, Alahan Monastir, Jambazlı, Dereazi, Kanlı Divane, and other isolated monuments. Second, extensive photographic documentation of every site visited, with particular attention to the distinctive building types and categories, cisterns, city walls, etc., and to the sculpted decoration of the buildings. Third, site plans and metric surveys of the monuments, although this last objective could only be prepared empirically because the group did not include specialists of this kind of work, nor were equipped with technical tools to carry out the job themselves. The sketches they outlined on site and the notes they took were later elaborated by architect Annalisa Gobbi and Alessandro Donato back in Rome. The group went back to Cilicia for a second time in 1994, in combination with a tour of Cappadocia. In fact, the region visited in these 2 trips was even larger than historical Cilicia, stretching to Anamur and further west to Alania, and Bimbir Kilise to the north. I am now going to show a gallery of photos which exemplify the kind of material that our scholars produced and the value that they can add to the already rich literature and visual documents on Cilicia. All of these monuments have one thing in common, and it is that they are very problematic, or at least were very problematic at that time when they were archaeological excavation had not was not at the satisfactory stage. And they were problematic because they were mostly in the state of ruins, and also because architecture of Cilicia, as we have seen, was unique compared to other regions of the Byzantine Empire. And so we don't have direct comparisons. Let us look, for example, at the monastic complex of Alahan Monastir. It is a very peculiar structure, as we see in the plan that has been drawn by Verzone. We know that so there are three churches, one in the east and one in the west, and we know that the building of the churches began from west. Why? Because there have been found tombs in the eastern part of the church, and since the tombs had to be outside, as we know, outside of the monastery enclosure, this is a hint that that area was not yet constructed when these tombs were realized. When were these tombs realized? We know because some of the sarcophagi bear inscriptions, such as this one that I'm showing here, and it's the tomb of Tarasis. There are two tombs of certain Tarasis. One is allegedly the father and the other one the son, and this is the old one who died in 462. So in 462, the eastern part was not yet constructed. But what is most interesting, according to our scholars, is the East Church, which is a completely new structure. It looks like a basilica, but it's not. It has pillars and transverse arches, and the central bay is larger than the other one. So how was it covered? The covering is not preserved, so we have to ask what was the what the upper part of the church looked like. So according to based on the observation of the feature of the lower part of the construction, we can say that there have been drawn different conclusions to that. So Gauch, according to Gauch, on top of the central bay there was a tower, and the tower had an octagonal wooden roof. Another hypothesis, which is also that of Verzone, sees this part as covered by a dome which probably had a light structure. So we see that this building is the example, like many other buildings in Cilicia, of experimentation, something that was completely new in the Byzantine architecture in the 5th century, and that had not is not documented, for example, in Constantinople at that time, but will be later. Another interesting feature, for example, is the decoration. So the portal of the Western Church is probably the most ancient decorated portal that we have in the Middle Ages. Also, there could be water infrastructures, because there was also a baptismal pool, and here we see a rare picture of one of the participants in the survey, in the expedition, and this is Andrea Paribeni, who is showing how deep the baptismal pool is. The second example that I'm going to look at with you is that of Dapazara. Dapazara is 20 kilometers away from Alahan and corresponds to the ancient city of Koropissos, the homeland of Emperor Zeno, as we mentioned. And Zeno himself had a church built here. According to the studies of Antonio Jacobini, that, as I mentioned, was a member of the expedition, this building was even a step forward compared to Alahan. There must have been a U-shaped aisle which surrounded, like an ambulatory, a space that, based on the thick walls, pillars, and reinforcements, must have been covered by stone vaulting, probably a dome. that was not visible from the outside. So from a methodological point of view, which is, I think, most interesting, because I know that among you there are people who are specialists of early Byzantine architecture of Cilicia, and I can, so my purpose is not to discuss about single monuments, but rather a methodological overview. So from the methodological standpoint, these experiences of the 1980s are still a reference, I think, for us. Before the trip, there was a thorough preparation, which involved attentive study of the state of the art. And then during the trip, a rich equipment was needed, such as guidebooks, the famous Guide Bleu, for example, road maps. There was no GPS, there was no Google Map as well. And also, methodologically, I think that the big intuition of De Maffei was to organize the trips together with the students who didn't have at all a secondary role in this preparation. Each one of them, furthermore, had a specific topic that he was in charge of focusing on. And they could choose what they wanted to study thoroughly. And that was real teamwork. It's something that we take for granted today. It's common now in the education of every student, especially every graduate student, but that was not always the case back then. So I think it was innovative somehow. On the site, the main tool, if we can say so, that was exploited was observation. This is a method that characterizes art history in general, so nothing new, apparently. It's based on science, it's based on what is visible at a given moment and on its interpretation. Also to this purpose, they consider necessary not only a first-hand close examination of the monument and of their current material condition, but also to get a feeling of the environmental conditions, such as orography, climate, accessibility to the sites. And this served to evaluate how much in the past natural environment would have impacted on life and therefore on the development of urban and suburban infrastructures. Such comments are particularly true for Cilicia. And if we look back, for example, at what Gertrude Bell wrote about her exploration at Cannes de Vannes, she says, and I quote, "The whole district is full of interest, but not easy to explore thoroughly owing to the rocky nature of the ground and the gorges that seam the hills. It is often necessary to make an immense detour to hit upon a road by which horses can travel, and the possibility of not finding water has to be considered even in the summer, even in early summer. Quite as important as the water question is that of fodder for the animals. The Yuruks cultivate little patches of ground, but in April, the new crop is not ripe and the small store of last year's grain is exhausted. And even where there is grass, horses traveling need more than grass to keep them in working condition." So that is a very different condition from that of today's tourist experience, for example, and much closer to the ancient medieval one, probably. But apart from the new roads, modern transportation, and the possibility to reach quickly the nearest village for food and fuel, in the 1980s, the landscape and the perception of its difficulties was still overall the same. Elsewhere, Gertrude Bell again lamented the excessive heat already in April and bushes growing everywhere, making difficult, for example, to draw precise sketches. 8 decades later, the condition that Bell described seems not to have changed much. The other aspect to be considered is a technical one. What was photography in 1980s? No digital cameras, no cell phones. They used film. And the film had to be spared. It was precious. That was not easy to find once you were far from big cities. And that is also why we have so little pictures, for example, of the protagonists, of the researchers themselves, because the film was all devoted to the monuments, to the details. We have thousands of shots taken where, to every possible detail of each monument. The goal, in fact, was expressly to build an archive that was to be used for documentation for students, so an educational purpose, and for scholars, so as support for the research, for future research. That was the explicit goal of the campaign. However, sometimes the attention was also captured by local life. And here the photo of the rug weaver resembles very nicely the photos that more or less at the same time were taken by Josephine Powell, for example. So I hope that I have shown in this brief overview how Cilicia can be a good case study to understand the potential of a historical photo archive. The collection of the archive of the Center for Documentation of Byzantine Art History is part of a fil rouge of visual documentation that began in the 19th century. The protagonists of these expeditions published only in part the material gathered during the trips to Cilicia, which means that the archive is still an enormous resource, still to be largely investigated. I could only show here a very limited selection of samples because unfortunately, the planned systematic digitization of the archive has been suspended due to the pandemics. But the Center for Documentation of Byzantine Art History preserves all of the photographs taken during the field trips to the Eastern Mediterranean, not just Cilicia. And in fact, the photos that I am showing do not refer to the material on Cilicia because the center is actually closed at the moment, unfortunately. Out of around 35,000 pictures total, the photographs taken during the trips to Cilicia and Isauria sum up to over 1,500, of which 587 color slides, all inventoried and in phase of metadata classification, around 850 negatives, both in black and white and in color and in different formats, around 100 printed photographs in black and white. To conclude, I wish to stress once again how important all this first-hand exploration were to construct and sometimes deconstruct critical ideas on early Byzantine and medieval art history of Anatolia. International scholarly literature on ancient Byzantine and medieval Cilicia has expanded a lot since the Rome team last visited the region, and intentionally I didn't go further with the survey of literature after 1989. It's really huge anyway, and the archaeological research has taken enormous steps forward. But along with their practical use, I believe that this heritage demonstrates once again that what we do as scholars is not without impact. So I like to recall that whenever we study a monument, an artwork, and reflect upon it, we live, apart from what we live in written terms or in material terms, we leave an imprint on the subsequent perception on the monument. So it's the research itself that somehow becomes part of the history of the monument. We are part of the history of the monument. So with this I conclude, and I wish to thank you all for your patience, and I look forward to your comments and questions.